Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture for MUS 1590. Today we are going to start discussing the concept of major keys, major key signatures, and major scales, and what exactly it is that means. So we want to give a little bit of historical context and then kind of dive into the nitty-gritty of what it is that I'm talking about today. So if you will, thus far in this class, we've kind of been learning a lot of vocabulary. Much like when you learn a new language, a large part of that is just learning words. We've been learning terms and ideas. We've been learning about notes and rhythmic values and clefs and time signatures. Right now we're really just trying to get some of this terminology down, and it doesn't necessarily have a ton of context to latch onto yet. But starting with this lecture and going forward, we're going to really try to contextualize things in larger musical ideas. So if you were to go back in time far enough, and I'm talking like the year 5, okay, going really far back and even further back than that, at some point it was decided that this general sound, this collection of notes, is a good one. Now, you should recognize that from maybe a number of places. As mentioned in a previous video, that sounds like do, re, mi from The Sound of Music, which you should have also submitted from your aural skills little video for the last week's module. But this might just be a familiar sound because you've heard it either in your past musical experience or because it's culturally relevant. This is the major scale. Now, there's quite a few interesting and historical reasons for why that exact pattern and arrangement and collection of notes has the meaning that it does. It didn't always, which is interesting. You have to remember that it took a long time for all of these sort of ideas and musical objects to coalesce into the system that we have today, where the major scale is such a large part of what it is that we are doing. We have other scales. We used to have scales that we no longer have, and we have other scales that haven't really necessarily reached their peak potential yet. But a scale is, just a collection of notes, and in this case, we happen to call that the major scale. Now, if you have a really great ear, or if you just happen to know, I'm playing what we would call the C major scale. All right. So if I wanted to write this out, I could add a treble clef staff, and I could start on C, and then it would be all of the notes of our musical alphabet going right back up to C. So we would have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and right back to C. So let's go ahead and label those: C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. Now, those are great because they happen to be the sort of unaltered versions of our musical alphabet. You'll notice that there are no sharps or flats, no accidentals of any kind necessary. It is C natural, D natural, E natural, F natural, and so forth. And they also happen to be the white keys on the piano. So there's no black keys. We don't have to use any of the notes that sort of live in between those pitches. And when I play those 7 notes, with 8 being the octave, when I play C again, it creates this particular sound. Okay, so just sort of take it for what it's worth that sound is something we want. It's agreed upon that is good, and it became very important from a music theory standpoint to be able to create that system in any number of ways. And by default on the keyboard, playing it in C major is really easy, and we can look at just the C major scale and learn an awful lot about what it means to be a major scale and, by result, a major key, as we will discuss in a moment. But let's just break up the parts of this C major scale for 1 second, and I'm going to say, let's break it into 2 halves. Let's say these first 4 notes and then these first 4 notes. And if you look carefully, you will notice that the pattern of the first 4 notes and the next 4 notes is the same. And by that I mean the intervals between the notes is identical from the first 4 to the next 4. So going from C to D, as we had talked about before, we could describe that as either a half step or a whole step. And we can use H for half step and W for whole step. And you'll notice that this is a whole step. We can say that the distance from D to E is also a whole step. And then the distance from E to F is a half step. Now, as mentioned, look at the next 4 notes of the scale. And we could also say that from G to A is a whole step. And again, if you look at a keyboard, you'll see that there's a little black key between G and A. We could have G sharp or A flat. So that's why it is a whole step, because it is 2 half steps. We can also say that the distance between A to B is a whole step, and that the distance from B to C is a half step. So notice these two things are equal, right? We have the same pattern from one half of the scale to the other. So this sounds an awful lot like this. All right, and it's great because we happen to have a name for that little pattern of whole, whole, half, and we call that a tetrachord. A major scale is essentially two tetrachords side by side, and there's one interval that we did not label yet, and that's the interval from F to G, which is also a whole step, okay? This is important, and if you can remember this, you should never be stumped by a major key or a major scale if you can remember this idea of a tetrachord times 2, okay? And then they are separated with this whole step. So if we have one tetrachord, which is this whole, whole, half pattern, and then we have another tetrachord, which is that whole, whole, half pattern, and if we separate them with a whole step, we will get a major scale 100% of the time. So we can look at this in a couple of different ways, and we can also build this on other notes and other scale degrees to get different patterns. So just to sort of break this off, if you don't notice what I'm saying that whole, whole, half, whole, and then whole, whole, half. If you can memorize that, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, right? So this is like tetrachord number 1. So let's say TC1. And then this would be TC2, tetrachord 2. And that they just happen to have a whole step in between them, separating them. That would also create C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. Each of these intervals can describe the space in between these notes. So exactly how and why that happened historically is a whole interesting conversation to have and something you might learn about in certain music history or music theory classes. But in this case, we can just agree that this is a good sound, right? It's this lovely combination of whole steps and half steps that we call the major scale. So with this concept of one tetrachord and then another, we can build major scales on any note. So let's go ahead and once again create a treble clef staff. And let's go ahead and start on a different note. Instead of starting on C, let's go ahead and start on G, okay? And let's just go up all the letters of the musical alphabet and let's see what sort of pattern we end up getting here. So we can look at each of these notes and the space between their next note and label it as a whole step or half step. So the distance from G to A is a whole step because there is a black key in between them. Here's G, here's A, and in between would be G sharp or A flat. All right, so that's a whole step. We could say that going from A to B is also a whole step. We could say going from B to C is a half step. So we're off to a great start for creating a major scale on the note G. Let's keep going. C to D is a whole step. D to E is another whole step. E to F is a half step. And F to G is a whole step. Now, we had talked about our pattern before, and you might notice that there is something amiss here. Our pattern for our tetrachord was whole, whole, half, and then we had a whole step to connect it to another tetrachord of whole, whole, half. All right, now it looks pretty good up to here, right? Here's our first tetrachord. That looks like tetrachord 1, and that seems just fine. And then it is separated by a whole step, so we're doing great right there. But then notice that our second set of pitches in the upper half of this scale goes whole, half, whole, instead of whole, whole, half. So we end up having an issue where this portion of the scale is no longer correct. In other words, if I play it, notice that there's a very subtle difference between the last two pitches, and it's not exactly what we want. Or really, I could even say the last 3 pitches. The relationship between those notes becomes incorrect. So let's just get rid of a little bit of this material here. And how could we correct this scale so that it includes the notes that we want and creates the pattern of whole, whole, half separated by a whole step, and then we get whole, whole, half again? We can solve this pretty easily, and the way to do it would be to add 1 sharp to this F, because suddenly now the distance from E to F also becomes a whole step, and the distance from F sharp to G becomes a half step. And if we play it, notice that it sounds, in terms of relationship, identical to the C major scale. So that's playing all the white notes on C. Now here's me playing the notes written on the screen currently. All right, so we took notes that did not conform to this whole, whole, half separated by a whole and then whole, whole, half step pattern, and we added a single accidental, in this case, an F sharp, in order to create that pattern, and we ended up getting the sound of the major scale, because the major scale is just that. It is a series of intervals, and if we follow that pattern, if we follow that series, we get a major scale every time. Let's go ahead and try this with one more note and just see what we end up with. Let's go ahead, in this case, let's start in the bass clef staff, and let's go ahead and start on the note D, and let's go ahead and go up each letter of the musical alphabet, so D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and then all the way back up to D. So let's take a look at what pattern we get here, and this time let's correct as we go if there are issues. So from D up to E, well, luckily we're off to a great start because that is a whole step. And E up to F, well, E to F, unfortunately, if I play that, is a half step. We need a whole step here. We don't want a half step. And in fact, what if we just write in the pattern that we are looking for right away? So we need whole, whole, and then we know that we need this to be half, and then we know we need them separated by a whole step, and then we know we need another whole step, another whole step, and finally a half step. We know that this is the pattern, right? This is going to be tetrachord number 1, as we call it. We know that we need to separate it with that whole step, and then we need another tetrachord of a whole, whole, half pattern. So let's make this a reality. So from D going up to E is a whole step. From E going up to F, well, it's not a whole step, so we need to add a sharp to make it a whole step. Now F sharp to G already becomes a whole step, so that's great. So we've seemingly solved that problem. G going up to A is already a whole step. A going up to B is already a whole step, but here we've run into another issue because B going up to C is a half step. It is not a whole step. So to make the distance from B to C proper, we can add C sharp, and suddenly, by adding F sharp and C sharp, we now have a major scale that starts and ends on D. So notice, once again, I was able to add, in this case, 2 accidentals, and I was able to recreate the pattern that makes that sound. So I am able, seemingly, to create a major scale starting on any pitch I'd like, as long as I apply the proper accidentals to create that pattern. Now, let's say I'm writing a piece of music and I want it to be built on like the note D or the note G or the note F. Maybe I want to do that because that sits well in my vocal range, or it fits well with the range of the instrument that I'm writing for, or I'm writing in that key because it sounds really good next to the key that came, in the piece before this, right? There's a lot of reasons to choose writing where one particular note is important, like being in D major. If I wanted to have the notes of that D major scale all the time in my piece of music, well, I could write out all those notes and then I could add an F sharp and I could add a C sharp every single time that I want to make those notes sound in a way that creates that pattern for me, but that could get a little cumbersome and laborious and difficult to read and difficult to write. So a long, long time ago, we came up with a better system, and we call that a key key signature. And a key signature is exactly that. It is a group of one or more flats or sharps at the beginning of each line or system of music. It shows all the accidentals that will be found in the music, okay? So if rather, than including in that D major scale where we had to have F sharp and C sharp applied to the notes, what if instead we just did something like this? So here's our treble clef staff, and here's D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and right back up to D, rather than having to write F sharp and C sharp here, and then any other time that we might get those notes. Instead, a key signature lets us add these accidentals at the beginning of the system right next to the clef sign. So we could include them right here, F and C. And once we've done that, that means those accidentals apply to every note going forward in that system. And what's great, even though we are only showing them on one line, they will apply to every F or C. So they would apply to the two currently written, they would apply to this one, they would apply to this C way up here. So even though we only see one in the start of the system right here, these two notes, if we see F sharp and C sharp in the key signature, that means every note that is F or C is now automatically made F sharp or C sharp. So I can get rid of these lines I drew, and those little brackets as well, and this system that I now have written would sound as a major scale like this. So those accidentals at the beginning of the system, called the key signature, allow that pattern of whole, whole, half, separated by a whole, 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 half, or two tetrachords to sound constantly in the music so that I don't have to always keep writing those accidentals. They now just apply to everything. So what we are now looking at is a chart that includes all major key signatures, including those constructed with sharps and those constructed with flats. Now keep in mind this chart is also showing us the minor key signature equivalent, but we will talk about that in the very near future. So all you need to worry about right now are the lines that say C major, G major, D major, etc. So really what this is a key or a code system for us that tells us what symbols need to appear at the start of a system in order to create a major scale on a particular note. So if we use the key signature of A major, that means if we play all the notes included with those sharps, we will get a major scale by playing those notes, which will be A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A. So notice if I just played the white notes on the keyboard, I get something quite different. But if I play these three sharps instead, suddenly it becomes a major scale. All right, so the key signature doesn't just exist arbitrarily or to confuse you. It exists so that all of the notes being played of the scale will conform to that tetrachord pattern that we were discussing. It is important to note the order and location of these sharps and flats that we use to create major key signatures. So you will notice that the first key signature that requires only one sharp would be G major. The next one would be D major, A major, and so on. And you'll notice that as we move upward, we add one more sharp each time. 2, 3, 4. The same thing down here in the key signatures created via flats. We begin with one flat for F major, and then two flats for B flat major, 3 for E flat, and so on. And you'll notice that this B flat, for example, begins on the central line, right? The third line of our 5-line staff in treble clef, and it begins on the second line of our 5-line staff in bass clef. But you'll notice that in each key signature I carry forward, that B flat stays in the same location in either treble or bass clef staff. It doesn't move around, and as mentioned, we don't need to add more than one. This single B flat applies to all B flats, regardless of where we are on the staff or within the system. So again, when I say that the order matters, that means that let's say I want to do this, single sharp of G major to create that. If I included a sharp down here, that would be incorrect. It needs to live on that top line, that fifth line of our staff, to be interpreted correctly. As mentioned, the order of these accidentals is also important. So you'll notice that we first add F sharp, then we add F and then C, then we add F and then C and then G. The fourth key signature here, E major, includes F, C, G, and D, okay? So we keep adding a sharp each time, but their location on the staff is important. And this shows you a nice textbook example of where each of these sharps and or flats lives, both in the treble clef and bass clef staff for all major keys. Once we learn minor scales, you will realize it works out super well because they are written the same way. But this does require some degree of memorization and practice, where if I ask you to quickly write me the key signature for F sharp major in a bass clef staff, you should be able to know that the order of the flats is as such: F, C, G, D, A, and if we keep going, we can add E or B, okay? And it's important that you also know where they exist on the staff. Usually I have found, just anecdotally speaking, that up to about 4 seems to be pretty easy for most people, both in the treble and bass clef and in terms of flats and sharps to require to create these key signatures. But something about once we hit like 5 and onward, sometimes it just seems to get a little bit tricky. So I do want you to practice these things. And I think it's also worth noting that you can memorize the order of these sharps, much like we memorized the order of notes on the lines or spaces of a staff. So one example for the order of sharps, which we can see all of them over here, which again, the letters would be F, C, G, D, A, E, B. So one example that is provided by a book that I'm referencing is "Fat cats gulp down almost every bite." Okay? That is something you might want to commit to memory, because at the very least, if you can remember "fat cats gulp down almost every bite," you can remember that the order of sharps is as such, and you can write each one on the staff. In terms of its position, it's a matter really, I think, of just noting the pattern that happens here. So notice how we sort of include one sharp and then the next one goes down, then the next one is up, and then the next one down. We do that for the first 4 sharps, and then we sort of start again where the next 3 or next 4 sort of create the same pattern. So we sort of end up getting this same little idea of here's the first few and then here are our next few as well. They sort of create a nice little down, up, and then sort of continuing that pattern, but simply lower. And you can probably understand, it makes some degree of sense as to why we wouldn't want to keep writing them in that exact pattern, because if we included writing sharps upward, and let's say this A sharp didn't go down an octave when we wrote it up here, kind of continuing that pattern, it might look a little confusing to the listener or to the viewer of the music, because it would need a ledger line through it and it would just be this sharp kind of floating up in space. So once again, I just want to reiterate that the order of the sharps and flats matters. You must write them in that sequential order, and you also must place them on the proper location of the staff, and you'll have a chance to practice that on some upcoming worksheets. Now, the order of flats is also just as important, so we want to make sure we have that memorized as well. And as we can see, we add first a B flat, and then we add an E flat, then A flat, and D flat, and G flat, and then C flat, and then lastly F flat. Okay, whether we're in treble or bass, they are adding in the same order. So if you do want to have a mnemonic device for those to memorize, that's fine. But one thing you might also notice is that they are in the reverse order of the sharps. So if the order of the sharps is this fat cats gulp down almost every bite, we know that the order of flats is simply that in reverse: B, E, A, D, G, C, and F. So whether or not you use a mnemonic device for the order of flats is entirely up to you, and I'm sure you could come up with any number of phrases or quickly find some online if you are so interested. I don't use one. I just remember fat cats gulp down almost every bite, or something very similar, and as a result, I'll just write that down, and then I know that I have the order for the flats as well, because it's simply the order of sharps in reverse. It takes time and practice, patience and diligence to become really quick with recognizing key signatures. I will say that, I do have these devices for memorizing the order of flats and sharps, and I did practice a lot in terms of how to write them on the lines and spaces and where to place things and where to make them look right and read them properly. But at a certain point of doing this, you will realize how quickly you just memorize these things and might not need to hold on to those mnemonic devices or other tricks. But that being said, make sure you are practicing and that you are diligent about memorizing these. There are some links to some resources on e-learning, namely musictheory.net. It has a great system for showing you key signatures, and you need to quickly label what it is. I highly recommend you practice that because it will be something you are tested on in this course. And if you are planning to take the basic music sequence that follows this course, you will need to be very quick with identifying and constructing major key signatures as well as minor key signatures, as we will talk about in the future. And you need to be comfortable with both the flats and sharps in treble and bass clef staff, and making sure you have the order and position of each of these things correct. The last thing that I want to mention in this lecture is that when it comes time to creating key signatures or writing out the scales that are created as a result of those key signatures, it's really important to remember something. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw a treble clef staff here. And if I want to, have the key signature of G major or D major or E flat major, it doesn't matter what the key signature is when it comes time to writing the notes of the scale. And what I mean by that is, if I am going to write a C major scale, notice how I start on C and every single pitch of the scale has a different letter name, right? C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, and then of course we could take it back up to C to complete the octave. Notice that each letter of the musical alphabet is represented, A through G, and repeating backwards, of course in this case starting on C, but the whole idea is that all of those letters are present in this scale, okay? Now, it doesn't matter if I am doing a C major scale or any other major scale. Whatever note I am going to start on, let's say I start on F sharp, let's say I want to have an F sharp major scale. Now, regardless of the accidentals I have to add along the way, or the accidentals that will appear at the start of my staff in the key signature, I am still going to write out F, G, A, B, C, D, E, and back up to F. Now, I'm either going to need to add certain accidentals to certain notes along the way, or add those accidentals to this key signature over here. That's not the point I'm making right now. The point I'm making is that every single major scale will still include representations from every single letter of the musical alphabet. You will never write a major scale, and as we will talk about in the near future, a minor scale, where you are missing a letter or include a letter twice. So for example, you could never have a scale. Let's say we're in the bass clef, and let's say we start on D. It doesn't look like a D. Let's start on D. You could never have something like D, E, F, F sharp, G, A, B, B sharp, right? Nonsense. It's impossible, okay? Every scale that you write that is a major or minor scale will always have one of each letter. And this can be a very good tactic for you. When it comes time to writing scales, you may not remember. Let's say you're having a bad day, you forgot about the tetrachords, you didn't memorize your key signatures the way you were supposed to, and you are tasked with writing a scale. And that scale is, A flat something, or G sharp something, or B flat something. It doesn't matter. You know what note it starts on. You can always, let's say it's B flat, you can always, that doesn't look like a B. You can always, always, always start with the note that is the name of the scale. So B flat major, you can start on B flat, and you can rest assured that this much of it will get you pretty far, including one note for each letter name working upward. Yes, we will have to apply more flats or sharps to make this the proper tetrachord pattern. In this case, we are missing an E flat, and if we do that, we now get the whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half pattern to create a major scale. But just as when we're starting on F sharp or C or D or B flat, I have one of every letter of the alphabet represented. And that's a really great way to make sure you are writing your scales correctly and getting a good concept grasped of what it means to have a major scale. It will always include one of each letter.